Hello, we are about to launch into a conversation about the future of democracy. We're talking about the health of what the founders of the United States believed strongly was an essential element of a functional democracy, that is, a free press. Specifically, we're going to talk about a new documentary called News Matters. News Matters looks at the impact and the importance of local news, not the national news, but what's happening in our own communities, the kinds of things that no matter what your political position, we all need to know about to make decisions in a democracy. I'm Laura Frank, Executive Director of CoLab, the Colorado News Collaborative. It's a new nonprofit that helps journalists from more than 130 news outlets across the state go deeper and reach wider with their local news reporting. And I know those of you watching this care deeply about local news because more than 150 of you sent questions and comments about it before we began this live stream. Many more of you are watching from the websites and social media of your local news outlets that participate in CoLab, and we welcome you. If you want to tweet about this conversation, please use the hashtag #NewsMatters. Now, let me introduce our panel. Greg Moore is former editor of the Denver Post. He decided to leave rather than continue to cut staff under the ownership of the hedge fund Alden Global. Chuck Plunkett was his former editorial page editor who led an internal revolt against the hedge fund. And Larry Rickman and Dana Caulfield started the Colorado Sun, one of the new efforts in Colorado to foster locally owned news outlets. Ken Doctor, CEO of Lookout Local, which is another new journalism effort, this one based in California, is the longtime publisher of Newsonomics, which is why we're talking to him today. And he, along with the others I've just introduced, are featured in the film. We also have Paul Chung, who is Director of Journalism and Technology Innovation at the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which helped fund the film. And finally, Brian Malone, the filmmaker of News Matters. Thank you all for being here. Let's watch a 5-minute clip of News Matters and then dive into the conversation.
It's sad, but inevitable. The business model went away. And so we're probably not too far away from not having any print community newspapers left.
What's it going to be like when there isn't that voice anymore that steps in and like plays a referee in a certain kind of way?
Welcome to the revolution!
One of the people
That's right, ladies and gentlemen, we have
fight,
before us a
who said,
revolution.
I'm not going to let this happen to America on this.
We are faced with a choice. It's either we're going to go with American values or we're going to go with socialism. We're going to go with extremism and radicalism.
You want to say that if any white people ever owned slaves, the Muslims still run slave trade? You wicked whore!
It's just this ocean of information that just is washing over all of us. And, mixed in with all of those wonderful nuggets of factual information is all of this other stuff, all of this noise, all of this misinformation and disinformation.
Disinformation is rampant and dangerous. In fact, BuzzFeed goes so far as to say that disinformation broke the United States in 2020.
We have a crisis of misinformation in this country.
I fear that people just rely on sort of fast food information. They get these posts from friends and others on social media. They don't bother to verify whether they're true or not. They just know that their friend or family member shared this, and they don't really give it much thought. There's just a lack of critical thinking. The people don't stop and wonder, how do they know that? Is it true?
With so many sources, separating fact from fiction can be confusing. A recent study from the Tow Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University found 1,200 websites claiming to be local news with questionable backgrounds, all run by Metric Media.
There are pay-to-play sites that have popped up that are masquerading as news sites.
It's a phenomenon known as pink slime journalism, where the stories aren't patently false but slanted and sometimes paid for by interested parties. Some articles like this one on Governor Polis were duplicated from other states, copied word for word with only the name changed.
There's quite a vacuum, and there's quite an opportunity for others who may not care about verifying facts, who in fact may have their own agenda, who may be trying to simply stir up misinformation and anger and distrust of the government. And that's a real danger for our democracy.
The best way we can show respect for the voters who are upset is by telling them the truth.
We can choose to accept the truth, or we can choose to reject the truth. But the problem is, a lot of people don't want to hear it, and they don't want to believe that it's the truth.
Why aren't you supporting President Trump?
I do support the things President Trump does. I think I agree with.
You're not supporting him.
I'm sorry, I do agree with many of the things he it's for, and I support those things.
Are you going to support him in the fraudulent vote system? You're a joke. Absolute joke. It's a disgusting shame.
It's dangerous for our democracy when we have millions and millions of people who don't want to hear the truth, who believe that there's an agenda behind facts.
The role of journalism is it's just absolutely central to civic life. We need the public to be engaged, and we need the public to sort of make an assessment as to what are reliable sources of information and what aren't. People tend to be drawn to news outlets that affirm their pre-existing point of view. There are any number of media outlets that are just there to pander, sometimes with information that is absolutely false and with all sorts of crazy conspiracy theories. I think that is dangerous for democracy.
We should be able to agree on our facts. Where are you getting information? You don't have journalists who are providing you verified information.
Okay, you may disagree with something we say. You may think we've said it wrong, but don't think we're being dishonest.
Say what you will about bias in mainstream media, but there are and were ethical standards that a lot of alternate voices have little or no interest in adhering to. If one person tells you it's raining and one person tells you it's sunny, it's not your job to quote both of them. It's your job to look out the window and figure out which one's right.
Okay, I am going to start with that last comment from David Milstead. It's your job to look out the window. I'm not quoting him directly because I don't have anyone on the, on the beep button for me. But, Robert Emmon asks, do you still believe in telling both sides of the story if one side is telling lies? Dana, you've spent a number of years in the newsroom. Is there a change? What do you think? How has the age of disinformation changed your job?
On some levels, I think it's improved it a little bit because we have to be so very careful to make, we've always been an accurate outfit. The accuracy has been paramount to what we do, but I feel like this sort of being under constant attack, while extremely stressful and upsetting in a lot of ways, also is forcing a new kind of vigilance on my part, that I feel extra committed to fact checking and making sure that we're not veering off into one political byway over another. And that's not all bad.
Lisa Chen, who's watching, asked, how have the ethics of journalism changed with the upsurge of violence and opposition against them? Greg, do you have a view on these two issues?
On how ethics has changed?
Right.
I'm not really sure I fully understand the question, but in the face of violence and threats against the media, I assume that's what the question is. I think we have to hew to the principles of accuracy and truth telling and independence, and not be cowed by threats or intimidation. You know, a lot of times when reporters and news organizations are being assaulted, like, you know, as we experienced under the Trump administration, you know, a lot of organizations will back off. They won't take on the tough issues. They won't call out the lies. And I think that in the face of those kinds of threats, you have to redouble your efforts, and you have to demonstrate the kind of courage to, you know, weigh in and call lies for what they are. So ethically,
I think we had an experience with that this past fall, right? When Helen Richardson photographed the shooting, and immediately Twitter lit up, and, you know, the news people were threatened with death. Helen was threatened with death. I mean, these are terrible things, and all we can do is stand up for the truth in that situation, which it was the not truth that was fomenting all of these threats of violence against her.
yeah, I agree with that 100%.
A great point. You know, in the film, Dean Singleton, who's the former owner of the Post, said, "We're not far away from having no print community newspapers left," which is hard to imagine. Tom Gujan asks, if you look far down the road, not 5 or 6 years, but 30 years or more, what do you think the local news landscape looks like? Paul, you've spent a lot of time thinking about the future of news. What do you think that looks like?
I mean, I think the future of local news is really a variety of news sources, right? So when we think about who they once were the local newspaper, the local public radio station, your local TV news network, right? So basically 3 media, right? Print, broadcast, and radio. And I think the future of local news is a variety of sources, right? It could be that single journalist who decided to join Substack and be a great newsletter for your community. It could be someone like the Colorado Sun, which is a digital nonprofit, right? It could be a podcaster. So I think, you know, in some way, the chaos that we see could lead to a proliferation of a new golden era for journalism, because journalism could be now telegraphed in all these different ways and platforms. And I think a really healthy local system, you will see a lot of different players from small fish to big fish. So there won't be sort of this dominance where, you know, back in the days where you have 2 local newspaper fighting each other, you have, you know, 3 TV stations try to scoop each other. I think the future, you're going to see a variety of players, and you're also going to see a whole new variety of partnerships in ways that we haven't seen before. Very much like the Colorado Media Project, right? Or Solution Journalism in Philly, where all these different news outlets come together to do a single topic like prison reentry for the community. So I think, you know, this is really painful to watch now, but I'm sort of optimistic in that future could be very different than the one that we had.
You know, you're talking about a very different kind of competition, which we know in some ways is very healthy. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, it's interesting to me, you know, how the more things change, the more they stay the same. You know, when I was a young journalist, in fact, when I was a journalism student more than 40 years ago, a professional journalist came to one of my classes and said to the entire class, "Don't do it. You'll never make a living in this business. This business is headed downhill." And we did what, you know, every young person should do, which is roll our eyes and ignore him. And we did it anyway. And the fact is, I share Paul's optimism. You know, to me, there's a lot to mourn, and we've lost a lot in the last 10, 15, 20, 40 years even. But I'm an optimist. I mean, there are signs of hope all over the place, whether it's, you know, Ken out in California, the Colorado Sun here, and others. You know, we're finding new ways to do the important work. You know, the question that you asked earlier about, or that a listener asked about ethics. I mean, we carry those things with us always to whatever platform we're at. And, you know, we're doing important work. To me, there's always going to be, you know, a place for important journalism. You know, we need it. And we'll figure out the platform. Dean's probably right. Print will go away, or at least be very limited, but the journalism will endure.
I mean, one thing I would add is this is an opportunity where we've seen journalism is centered around audience, right? I mean, there was a time where journalism makes so much money, is really a very top-down approach, where now is really about your community and the needs. And for the first time, we might have chance to really center journalism around equity in ways that we haven't seen before.
Thank you. We're going to talk. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, I would add that I am, and Larry and all of us that have started these things know this. I mean, you have to really be an optimist to to start up one of these things in these times, and I am that. At the same time, 30 years is 2051. I can tell you in many communities, including this one where we launched in Santa Cruz, the memory of local news is fast declining. People who are 50s, just 60s maybe, they understand what a good local newspaper once was as an information source. And one of the things you see in these communities is people will read the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, and they're not sure they need local news anymore. It's disappearing, and I think muscle memory of local news is disappearing. And it's not just a US problem, a North American problem, it is a problem of Western society. So I salute all of the many colleagues and peers out there who are doing things, and some of them quite good. But overall, we are losing much more news, local understanding than we're gaining. And I fear that many generations now, really don't have a sense of what local news is and don't seek it out, even if it's there.
Ken, let's dig into that a little bit more. Elaine Lee is asking, why do some people claim more faith in the merits and future of local or community-based journalism than other journalistic endeavors and possibilities? Why local news?
Why is local news important or more?
Why is local news important? That's really what we're talking about today.
Sure. Local news, particularly in the United States, across 3,000 miles, we have a very different system than, for instance, the Brits. If you look at that little island over there, they have a vibrant national press that Rupert Murdoch has done his best to ruin, but has not completely ruined. But it is largely a national press, and the regional press there is weak, but it is less important. American democracy is based on, look at our fights that we still have about states' rights. We are based on local democracy, and local democracy at its root demands local knowledge and understanding of what the issues are. And we have elections across the United States, local elections as well as national ones, where people have no idea what the heck they're voting on because there's no information other than placards and voters pamphlets. So unless at a basic root, unless you have broad, factual, nonpartisan news that people can understand about what's going on at their city councils and their school boards and their county boards, you cannot have an active democracy. That's the problem, and it's especially one across the United States.
Chuck, you wrote eloquently about this. Share your thoughts with us on the importance and the impact of local news.
Yes, thank you. This was driven home to me a year ago and change when the pandemic first really took hold, and the university ordered that we would go remote, and many students were going back home, and they and their parents were very upset, very concerned, seeking information. So here I am teaching journalists, student journalists, digital natives, who you would think would be all over local news. And yet many of them were admitting that they hadn't known about some of the primary local news outlets, and that they were now hungry for looking at reports from the Colorado Sun or for Colorado Public Radio or those kinds of things. And they would say, I didn't realize that I was only reading, the Washington Post, or I was only reading the New York Times. And my parents were amazed. And that has been my concern, is that if you have digital natives who are majoring in journalism and they're not actively consuming local news, what is that saying about all the other 21-year-olds in our country right now? And Ken's discussion about the muscle memory that it takes to be a good citizen, a good informed citizen, and the work that it now takes to do that. You know, you end up subscribing to quite a few sites now. And how much of your day can you do that? I think we forget, I didn't know what it would be like to no longer be in a newsroom, how you're not connected to the constant breaking news. You're not always in the thrum. You're not always being challenged to think about news events as they occur. You have the luxury of doing it once a day, or once or twice a day, that kind of thing. And so, and that's coming from someone who loves and believes and teaches journalism. So that's the fear that I have, is that I value diversity and a broad number of media outlets because it protects us against what we saw with the ravages of Alden, right? But then the work that consumers have to do, that leaders have to do to stay on top of all that is significant. And so I worry that important journalism that's being done is going to get lost.
Brian, I want to turn to you. Why this film now? Oh, you're on mute.
No, I thought I was unmuted. I was unmuted the whole time.
There you go.
First of all, I'd just like to thank Chuck for getting a haircut for this big event. Thank you. You look like a hippie last time I saw you, you Bolshevik. Kidding. I just want to address the topic here. I agree with what everyone is saying about what the problems of local news are. What I think we have to realize that local news affects our daily lives more so than national news. The Times or the Washington Post are important, and we seem to be drawn to that now. I don't know, maybe it's the national political climate that we are all living in, but the truth of the matter is what Ken said is like local school board elections, city council elections, bond issues, that kind of thing. Those are the things that are going to really affect our day-to-day lives in our own communities, more so than, a national policy on one thing or another, more directly anyway. And so I think the question is, and this is part of the answer of why I did the film now, is that, I'm raising two young people who are going to be the next generation of adults. And, maybe it's the age, maybe it's the social media climate we live in, but, they, like most of the next decision makers, the next generation of decision makers, have no interest in what we're talking about here tonight. And that's a real stark reality. And maybe I didn't either when I was 21 or 22 or whatever. But I think we really need to be looking for, back to that future question, is how do we make news not necessarily entertaining or fun, but we have to make it engaging in some way. And I know there was some talk about starting to put out, bits of news on different social media platforms, TikTok and Instagram and that kind of thing. We can debate whether that's really meaningful news or not. But I do think that we all need to be thinking of those new avenues of delivery and making them palatable so that we have an audience. Because the question is news a public service or is news a product? And the answer is that it's both. And I feel like we have to find that balance. Now, back to the question of why I did the film. Well, again, I bring it back to Plunkett. He's got a big mouth, and he's got a way of drawing attention to himself and his cats. So I felt like it was me being a cat person myself, it was a natural fit. So no, honestly, the story kind of jumped out. And as a working journalist myself, I like to make documentary films. I like to do stories that I feel are important. This is one of those stories that kind of like slaps you in the face and says someone needs to do this. And there's a lot more to the story underneath this initial revolt or whatever you want to call it. I mean, that's unheard of when you think about the fact that journalists are now on the other side of the protest line. That's a pretty unique situation. So that's at least what sparked it. But like any good story, as we all know, you start digging and you find that there's a lot more underneath the surface. So one thing led to another. 3 years later, here we are.
Carl Chua wants to know, to what extent is this crisis in journalism a totally new thing? And to what extent is it a repetition of past events? Can you give us some historical perspective here?
So the recent history is the most instructive, and this fact that the newspaper industry, and as Dean Singleton refers to it, the print industry, which a lot of people in that industry are still focused on into 2021. The newspaper industry has not had a year of revenue growth since 2007. That's now 14 years. So this history has gotten worse ever since 2007, although actually the newspaper business numbers started to decline right after the turn of the century. So that's a long time now. That's almost 2 decades. Before that, of course, there are all kinds of trends in American newspapering going back to Ben Franklin, but the newspapers were strong as basic information sources. There were many of them there were numerous ones in many cities. We had the time after World War II when they essentially became monopolies in cities, but owned by chains. And sometimes you had good chains and bad chains and some individuals. And they made a huge amount of money. But the trend lines were there. TV started to take out money a long time ago, but there was plenty of it until the turn of the century. And now we are still suffering from that same phenomenon, and really a print industry that didn't know how to change itself, and now is being taken over by vultures who are just milking the last money from out of the industry, which is still importantly profitable. So that's the recent background of that of this industry.
We have 2 questions. Dorothy Sheps and Beverly Sloan want to know, how can we preserve independent journalism at a local scale with the Alden Globals and social media domination? Greg, you must have thought a lot about this. The Denver Post is still today the second biggest newsroom in Colorado, and work that they've done has resulted in changes in laws and policies since the rebellion. The Post has a functioning newsroom, if an uncertain future.
Yeah, no question. I mean, the Post and other local newspapers are doing the best they can with the resources that they have, but there's no question that hedge funds and Facebook and Google have really undermined the financial stability of local newspapers and local newsrooms, right? But now it's given us a new opportunity to sort of look at other avenues for financially supporting the pursuit of local news, and that includes philanthropy. I think it includes tax-supported financing of journalism, similar to what you see with the BBC or the public PBS. There are a number of different revenue models that are being explored. And 15 years ago, we would have turned our nose up at the idea of nonprofits, foundations owning newspapers and things of that nature. And I'm convinced and I'm optimistic that we're going to find a way, because the demand for news is not going to cease. People are going to always want to know why things happened, how they happened, and how they can be fixed. And that's the crux of news, is answering those basic questions so that people can really act and be a full participant in their democracy. So while there are a lot of negative forces at work, there are also great opportunities, and it's just a matter of having the will to find them.
Oh, a great point. This is just in from Jane. I don't know if she's a member of the Gen Z or millennial generation, but she says they crave information, They just need access and absorb it differently than previous generations. Credible journalism needs to find that pathway, she says. Maybe documentaries are one of those ways, which is good news for Brian. Paul, do you have some thoughts, either following up on what Greg was saying or the comments that Jane is making?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really unique right now is you have, for the first time in a very long time, you have 5 generations of American working side by side in any industry. So in journalism in particular, is 5 generations of American in a contracting industry, right? So everything that we see playing out, the expression of journalism to the distribution of journalism to what journalism is really, everything that we talk about is just really the tension between the people who are in control and have one particular viewpoint, what journalism is and can be, versus a different generation's understanding or desire of what journalism is. So, in some way, when we talk about local news, like, the muscle memory, I'm sort of sandwiched in between those generations, where if something is really important, I believe it will find its way to me, right? So, a very simple example is, yesterday I was I'm in Miami. Yesterday I was at the beach. I left the beach just in time before a tornado, a real mini tornado, went through South Beach. And, on my way back, I'm just like, oh, the wind is really weird. And then what happened? I just turned on TikTok and suddenly all these videos about Miami tornado popping up. And then I see sort of some news report doing it and they cut a version. And I wasn't even intentionally looking for local news, but somehow it find its way to me. And I think a lot of the younger generation, they have that expectation. And so I think the question for us to really think about is, what is the journalism product and what is a different distribution channel that makes sense for the audience that you want to serve? I think print itself still have a very relevant context, but it is not, should it be daily? Maybe not for every single community. So I just think, what's different in the future is you're going to find these sort of individual product that work with these different audience. And the way we think about local is not necessarily geographically defined, but it's both geography and sort of, personality, right? Or sort of how you identify yourself, right? As Asian American, what's local to me is very different than what's local to, a Miami Cuban.
Could I jump in just for a second? I'm sorry. I want to kind of dovetail into what Paul was saying. I think another big part of this that we really need to talk about in the greater conversation is media literacy. There's a lot of different talk about what kind of model we can put out there to have a greater engaged audience. But the other side of that is you have to have a mechanism. We're living in a world right now where I feel like we're overwhelmed with technology and we really don't know how to sift through it all yet. We don't have the wisdom. We have the technology in front of us, but we don't know how to, eat a healthy diet necessarily. And there's a lot of junk food in there. And I feel like, first it was 500 channels of cable, and now it's all these social media channels, and it's just never ending deadlines and a constant flow of information. The other side of that upstream, and I don't know exactly how this happens, maybe it's in the education system, civic engagement, whatever, but I don't think you can have a new model of journalism, whatever form it takes, without a robust national program of media literacy. What is the truth, whether you like it or not? Just saying.
Do we need media literacy, panel?
I mean, think about the other end of that. I mean, clearly media literacy is important, and this problem that we're addressing doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are a lot of bad actors out there, and from Vladimir Putin to all the people purveying misinformation and disinformation. In the film, you talk about the pink slime people. There are a lot of people who have partisan political objectives in working this atmosphere. And we are up against that. At the same time, we are talking about experimenting and trying to find a future. You think about what we're talking about so much now as a society of like these new variants versus the vaccines. Well, we're up against trying to figure out what do people in our craft say? They say we're trying to figure out what's going to work. And we've been saying this now for literally 10 or 15 years. At the same time, it's gotten worse and worse. And the actors there all around us are just salivating. We could well have, with the consolidation that I've had to cover in the last 5 to 8 years, we could have not just a Gannett and an Alden, you could have Gannett and Alden pushed together into one. There's nothing to stop one newspaper company and anybody could buy it. And then you will have a very different society. And I think Brian's point about media literacy and my own experience doing this, we just launched 5 months ago, is that media literacy to me isn't national. I mean, you can do any kind of national campaign, that's great. It is simply doing the work locally and flooding the zone with factual, nonpartisan news and getting it into schools and places that need it and proving out media literacy day by day by day, rather than talking about media literacy.
Yeah, I'd like to just add, I mean, I have teenage daughters, and I think that the school systems have actually, whether it's inadvertent or not, really helped in this regard. I mean, students nowadays really know how to determine credible sources of information because they don't want to be accused of plagiarism or whatever. They've become really good researchers and discerners of credible sources of information. And I just want to, one of our spectators or participants noted that it's really important that we involve the educational system and media literacy. And I think that is happening. And it's a positive development.
Dana, what did you want to add?
Well, I think we've got a fundamental difficulty that's baked into this whole, we have to teach everybody what media literacy is. And in fact, we have new media channels that are trying to get in front of, or like the Colorado Sun or our friend Shay at the Boulder Beat over in Boulder or the Northern Colorado Optimist. And we have to use the social media as our marketing channel. I mean, Lookout Santa Cruz doesn't just land in somebody's driveway. You have to deliver it somehow through these newsletters, through social media, Facebook, whatever we're doing. And so we're in conflict with ourselves, right? We need to flood the zone of these social media channels that we're saying, deliver us a bunch of crap. So how do we get past that difficulty until everybody graduates from high school with their degree in media literacy? It's a huge challenge.
I'd say we need to look in the mirror a little bit as an industry as well, because we all know that there's been a consequence to the slashing of newsrooms. What are the things that get thrown overboard? The investigative journalism, the meaty stuff, the watchdog journalism that's hard to do, it's expensive to do, it takes a long time. So you do less of that. What you do more of are things that generate clicks, the zoo babies. I love zoo babies and they generate a lot of page views, but it's pretty shallow stuff. And when I speak to university classes, I always ask, who here subscribes to a newspaper or a magazine or something? And usually there's a lot of, people just sort of don't look at me. And I asked one young woman, tell me, why don't you care where you get your news from? Because she couldn't answer, my question when I asked her, where do you get your news? And she said, well, the news is just depressing. It's a downer. And, and I said, well, look, with all due respect, it's like saying you don't like food because all you've ever eaten is fast food. If you don't pay attention to where your news comes from, what we're trying to do at the Sun is, and other places, I know Ken's doing this too, is feed you a fine meal, with a kind of meal where you have a glass of wine, a cup of coffee, and feel like you push back from the table at the end of it and wow, that was a meal. And that focus on quality, it's not easy. We do it because it's hard. And as an industry, I think we've gotten away from that. And if people are turned off by the news, you made the point, Laura, that we need to engage people. That's on us. We need to produce journalism that is engaging people. And again, I'm an optimist about it. you guys have heard me say this before. I mean, legacy newspapers, the average time somebody spends on a story is about 45 seconds. The average time that people have spent on stories at the Colorado Sun over the past 2.5 years is more than 3 minutes. And, we're not doing zoo babies.
Paul, what do you want to
mean, I think part of the problem is the word journalism, right? Like it means this other thing. When I think about, so I went on the street and actually did some user interview with millennials and generation about news. Some of the feedback I got was really incredible. Is yes, the news was depressing, but more importantly, they say is not actionable for them. So they read this, what is it they could do about it? How does this solve the world's problem from their perspective? And, and this other story that it really resonates for me is, I've been doing some work with KPCC and during COVID, they flooded with 800 plus questions about COVID. And, they was like, how do we answer all of them? They only have 4 engagement editor. So we use some technology to sort of sort that out. And at the end, they produce an event to walk people in LA, show them digitally, how do you file unemployment? Because that was the things that the community really care about. And KPCC, was thinking about, especially Ashley Alvarado, she was thinking, how do we reorient KPCC to be LA's help desk? And that's really the mindset that we are really missing in a lot of journalism outfit. We're so busy producing what we call quote unquote journalism, we forgot what problem are we solving for our community? What are their problems? How do we get to the bottom of it, and could we solve it for them? And so the word journalism have this very romantic notion. And so somehow, how could we sort of connect that to, especially local journalism is really service journalism, right? There's a freaking pothole. Who do I need to call to get that fixed? Why is my traffic stop always a mess? It's they're not going to win you Pulitzer Prizes, but that's the thing that a lot of communities need.
You know what, Paul, that's a really good point. I was saying to someone the other day that I get a lot of news through my Ring security network. And that was how I learned that people were stealing catalytic converters from vans. They were sharing that information on the network. And the same is true for next door. So there are a lot of different ways that you can get information that's really vitally important to you, as a local community resident. And it's not necessarily the traditional journalistic avenues. That's a very good point.
Oh, Chuck, I saw your hand.
Yeah, thanks. So one of the things that makes me very uncomfortable these days is that we do a lot of internships. I have an advisor for several students who find their ways into local papers, and they're discouraged by the work. And the reason they're discouraged is instead of having an environment or an opportunity where they get to work on a story and they get to work on it just for several hours before they show it to an editor, they get a press release and they say, get this to me in 10 minutes. And then they get another press release and say, get this to me in 10 minutes. And that goes on all day long. And so they're discouraged, but think of what that means. That means that the kind of newsrooms that you can get into as an entry-level reporter not only aren't being able to invest in the kind of long-term investigative journalism that is so important to our profession, they're not able to give a daily story the time and attention it deserves. When I first started in the business, I knew that I didn't want to work for a paper where I had to write more than one story a day. That sounds incredibly lazy and elitist right now. The poor people that are working at even large newspapers in Colorado now are churning out multiple byline stories a day. The pace that they are under, the strain that they are under to produce news and to feed the beast is incredibly difficult and incredibly soul sucking. And you know that you're going to be cutting corners and you're not going to be doing the news the justice that it deserves. And so if that keeps happening, the people who are trying to get the news, the public who want media literacy, who want to be informed, they're going to have a really difficult time differentiating who's worth following and who's not. Just because you have technically a brand name behind you isn't going to mean that much if a blogger who is more successful at developing sources gets it right more than the mainstream paper does.
Thank you. Ken.
I just want to come back to what Paul said, and I really agree with it. And there's several things in there. I mean, and specifically the work, and if you worked on it, congratulations on what KPCC has done and what Ashley has done there. And it is really a reorienting of where they had been moving. KPCC, Southern California Public Radio, has tried to figure out a different kind of relationship to its audience, and especially the changing diverse audience of Los Angeles over a number of years. And you talked about, Paul, the notion of a help desk, and it's involved in service, as you're saying. It is very interesting to think about it. We've talked about news moving from kind of like it's a newspaper, that's what it is, to it's a product and getting our arms around that. And it's a really different concept to think of it as a service. And if it's a service to the community, then there isn't this differentiation between saying you're going to cover a city council meeting and you're going to let people understand what's important to them about that city council meeting that, as you said, is actionable. Now, it's not like newspapers haven't done this. It's been, their orientation's been more this way, and they were not good listeners. When you combine that power of reporting with a real commitment to service and to listening and use all the digital channels that we have, then you really have something. And so there are really important models out there, and I think that is one of them that you pointed out.
Thanks, Ken. We've got several people in the chat asking about funding and business models. Steve Zansberg and Alfonso Porter. We also had Steve Chrisman saying, I used to think public funding of news was the road to state media. Now I wonder if you think it's the most fair alternative available. Marilyn Saltzman asks a similar question about government subsidies, and Chris Barge wants to discuss the pros and cons of the nonprofit versus for-profit model. Who has some thoughts about state funding and nonprofit versus for-profit?
I actually just want to follow up on what Greg was saying. I think 20 years ago, I was just extremely hardline about it. Like, no, you wind up with Pravda if the government is funding journalism. But the reality is, that newspapers have been dependent upon government funding for generations. They're called legal notices, right? That has been a source of important funding. If legal notices went away today, a lot of other newspapers would go out of business. They would be crippled or they would be gone. So there's already been some government support of newspapers. I don't know that I'm quite with you, Greg, all the way on an NPR model for newspapers. That could work. I'm open to that possibility, which is surprising to me. I wouldn't have been a few years ago. I mean, what you don't ever want is a journalist dragged before a Senate panel, asked to, explain themselves for, about some investigative project or whatever. Obviously, nobody wants that, but it's an interesting discussion.
Greg, you've written about this very topic.
Yeah.
How have your thoughts evolved on that?
I'm open. I am truly open. And, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I would not have been. Look, the advertising model was not sacrosanct. Okay. Like, the corporations in our communities, they were footing the bill for the journalism, and we were covering them. And not a whole lot of people were talking about conflicts, right? We had a firewall and we accepted it. The public trusted it. When I think about public funding, I think more about taxpayer supported funding as opposed to government funding. And I think the taxpayers having a financial stake in quality journalism, I don't have a problem with it. I think it's up to us to figure out how to do that the right way. And I think that, one of the questions you asked earlier was, is this new? Well, no, it's not new, but the public was shielded from sort of the ravages of journalism for a long time. And, after the rebellion and similar things happening around the country, I think they were fully exposed to what was going on with local news and the local news industry. And I think they're ready to be told, here are some ways that you can help preserve this important franchise that's important to you personally on the local level. So I'm very open to that. I'm very open to foundations. I'm very open to philanthropy. I'm very open to sugar daddies. If there's another Bezos out there, please come forward. We need you.
There's some talk in the chat about, what kind of influence people and entities like that might have. How do we guard against undue influence?
And if you look at it and pick up on what Greg was saying, answer that question, the nature of human society, and not just journalism, is wherever you get money, there's going to be influence. And we did see that in newspapers, and those of us that could work for good companies, there was a firewall that existed always or almost always, or I remember meeting with the home builders and the car dealers once a year.
That's right.
And, insulating my newsroom from. Mm-hmm. Same thing with how much of the burgeoning local news experimentation is based on what Facebook and Google want to do. And so it's always a question. And if it's a billionaire, which billionaire is it? To me, I favor more the taxpayer approach if it's going to happen. And basically, it's a smell test. Can the journalism, wherever it gets its money, be independent? And can it proudly be and transparently be independent? I am old-fashioned in that way, and that's what we're trying with our model and saying, have readers pay for it individually, like the New York Times has done so successfully, so that you could have 10,000 New York Times readers complain tomorrow. It doesn't make any difference because there's so many of them. So you want to diversify your risk of where you're getting your money. The best way to do that is to get it mainly from readers and many, many readers, and secondarily from advertisers.
And you make a good point about transparency. I mean, that is the key. Just be upfront where you get your money from. Evan Smith, the editor of the Texas Tribune, editor and co-founder, put it really well, which is like, look, you can always go find more money. You can't find your integrity again. So as a news organization, our name is everything. I think as long as we're willing to be transparent and make it clear to anyone who's giving us money, whether it's the government or a foundation or a business, we're not for sale. Our integrity is not for sale.
We use a little catchphrase with our students. They want to say, how can we get people to trust us? If they're calling and they're university students and they're trying to get sources, it's much more difficult than if you're calling and you're saying, I'm from the Colorado Sun or I'm from the New York Times. And we say, be trustworthy. Make them see that you are trying to get the news. Make them see that you are trying to really understand what's going on. And if we just apply that same rule of thumb to how we present ourselves to the public, that's how we build our brand. And that's how we get them to go along for whatever experimental funding mechanism we might try. I'm following Greg Moore's lead on the public funding, and I'm open to the idea. I don't know that I've settled on a model. I know that I haven't settled on a model, but I'm glad that people are talking about it and thinking about it.
Yeah, I don't think there's any emerging winning models. I think right now it's just really is sort of like investing in your 401. It's a balanced portfolio. You need to have advertising is not dead. It still brings in quite amount of money. It's just really balancing what is the what ratio of advertising versus subscriber versus philanthropy versus even, thinking about how do you turn your content into intellectual IP that you could then sell it to Netflix or, create a podcast. I just think there's different vehicle. So I think we're more agnostic whether it's for-profit or non-profit, but I think the focus is really defining what independence is, right? I think independence is that for a news outlet, they have to be able to walk away from anybody, whether it's a philanthropist, advertiser, a group of subscriber, when they do something that, that they don't like, they have to be able to sustain that loss, right? If they could, then that's winning. And I think that's sort of like the formula everyone is trying to calculate, right? How do we get to that winning formula? And I think that is still a bit of an unknown, but there's a lot of experimentations going on, a lot of hypotheses, and I think the more the merrier.
I think one of the things, if I could jump in just for a second, just kind of a common thread, and it was one of the main reasons why I made the film. And the common thread with all of this is that the human race, the human being, needs to hear stories. That's how we communicate. That's how we learn. And I think the common thread, whatever model this takes, good storytelling, good factual storytelling that has, I was always taught the WIFM acronym. What's in it for me? Why does this story matter to me? What, good, bad, or otherwise? Story doesn't always benefit me, but the truth sometimes hurts. But the truth helps us all in the way. And I kind of hang my hat on what Larry said toward the end of the film. He said, we're in the business of telling the truth. We can't force people to tell the truth, but our job is to tell the truth. And I feel like, kind of in one of the earlier comments, I think that if we tell good, impactful stories that impact people, that touch people in different ways, and show the value, that's our product, if you will. It's a value that an informed public, it's the vehicle in which a public becomes informed. And I think there's a lot of talk about business models, but I feel like at the core, we have to really continue to find stories that, to Larry's point, aren't just low-hanging fruit, but real meaningful stories that help people understand why this matters to you. I mean, news matters, you might call it a dark comedy or a horror film, whatever you want to call it, but it's important. The subject matter is important and it impacts all of us. And I feel like if we can find some way to just communicate that to the greater world, we might be able to get over this misinformation pandemic and the whole business model challenge that journalism is facing right now.
Thank you for those words, Brian. I think, we have only 2 minutes left, so I think we're going to pause there for a second. And I just want to say that we have gotten so many fantastic comments and questions from the folks who are watching this here with us. And this conversation could go on, and it can go on. I want to invite people to continue the conversation on Twitter, for example, with your local news outlet. And those questions that we didn't get to tonight, please share them and we can continue this conversation with the hashtag News Matters. And I want to invite everyone to watch the full documentary, News Matters. It will be on Rocky Mountain PBS at 10 p.m. on April 27th and at 7 p.m. on April 29th. And then finally, if you would like to host your own conversation and screening of News Matters, you can do that. You just visit the film's website. That is newsmattersfilm.com. And if you liked this conversation, please go to collabnews.co, that's as in Colorado, and you can sign up there so we can let you know when other events like this are happening. I want to thank our panel, each and every one of you, for the work that you're doing to try to further the value and the sustainability of local news. And I want to thank all of the people who are with us on Zoom and on YouTube and on the websites of the CoLab partners who are streaming this, and those of you who will continue the conversation on Twitter for your dedication and understanding and support of local news, because I think what you've heard here tonight is the bottom line is it's all about you. It's about the public and our communities. So thank you for being here tonight. Thank you all.